I looked back on my education experience and said, wow, I was really well schooled, but I don't feel well educated. Here we are where more and more families recognize that teaching and learning can and should be different. Parents are just no longer putting up with outdated one-size-fits-all mass schooling system.
Growing up homeschooled, people would look at you like you had two heads and right to your face be like, well, you're not going to be able to socialize. Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I'm your sometimes host, Isaac Morehouse, CEO of OpenEd, and I'm joined today by a legend. I'm joined by Kerry McDonald, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. She's the host of the Liberated podcast, the Liberated newsletter, the author of the book Unschooled, and a force to be reckoned with when it comes to opening education. So, Carrie, welcome to the OpenEd podcast.
Isaac, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I want to start out, you just mentioned something new that you're doing at FEE. So you've got the Liberated podcast and newsletter, as I mentioned. What is the Ed Entrepreneurship Lab? Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, it's really exciting. We just launched it this month, the Education Entrepreneurship Lab at FEE. Basically, the idea was, I came on to my senior fellow role at FEE in the spring of 2019, talking about innovative education, the entrepreneurs that were creating new schooling models, the growth and diversification of homeschooling and other sort of decentralized education possibilities. And then COVID hit, all of the interest in that world exploded. And so I continued to do a lot of writing in that space. I launched the podcast in the beginning of 2022, the Liberated podcast, to feature the stories of these founders that were creating these new schools and spaces. And we've just realized that as momentum continues to grow, we wanted to have something even bigger. And so the Education Entrepreneurship Lab, which I am leading, includes LiberatED as one sort of initiative that we're working on, but it also includes some other things as well, including the Cole Summers Fellowship Program, which we launched a pilot of this past year. That is a writing fellowship, sort of a platform creation fellowship program for teenagers who learn in unconventional education environments, so them to be able to share their experiences. The lab also includes a new Enterprising Founder Award program that we're just launching again this month that encourages school founders and others running these innovative education programs to apply and talk about how they embrace the freedom philosophy around individual freedom, free markets, entrepreneurship, private property, limited government, and how that's impacted their individual enterprises and their communities. And then we also have a new Entrepreneur in Residence program where we're bringing on school founders, people running actual schools, these unconventional schools, and having them talk about their experiences as entrepreneurs running those programs. So it's an exciting time. We feel like there's so much momentum here. We just want to be a part of it.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So everyone listening, if any of those things that Carrie just described fits you, you know where to go. The FEE Ed Innovators Lab. So, Carrie, I would love to start just with a little bit of your personal story. I mean, I came across you, met you, I don't know, sometime in the 20 teens, just from your writings, and very, very in line with my own beliefs about education. I was building Praxis or maybe Crash at the time. And so the idea of, building private alternatives and giving people different options. But how did you get to this spot? Like, what's your background?
Yeah, well, just to make a point on that, Isaac, I featured you in my Unschooled book. I interviewed you to hear about your story as a homeschooler and then creating Praxis. So that was very much a part of my Unschooled book that came out in the spring of 2019. But my story really began back when I was an economics major as an undergrad many years ago. And I just fell in love with economics and the economic way of thinking, which was unlike anything I had encountered before.
Wait, where were you going to school here? Because a lot of, I have met people, I remember way back in the day, I was doing college campus work in Michigan, and I met some people that were majoring in economics at, I think it was Michigan State. And they had never heard of F.A. Hayek. And I said, well, have you ever heard of the Austrian school? And they're like, what's that? I'm like, have you ever heard of the Chicago school? They're like, what do you mean school? And I'm like, do you know the concept of different schools of economics? And they were like, no. So not all economics majors are the same. Even the economic way of thinking is not always taught. Sometimes economics is more just statistics and econometrics. So I'm curious where you did your undergrad and what type of economics you were learning.
Yeah, my economics was much more of the sort of econometric statistics base. I was at a small liberal arts college, Bowdoin College in Maine. And so, hadn't really discovered the Austrian School of Economics or any of the work that now is sort of pivotal to my writing and my outreach. But I just fell in love with this whole idea of economics and the incentives that people have to produce, to consume, what is sort of guiding human behavior. And I just really loved that. And one of the things that happened as I was studying economics was I started to wonder, why do we have so much choice and variety in so many of the sort of market-based parts of our lives that are operating within a free market, but we don't seem to have that choice and variety when it comes to education. And then I sort of started going down that rabbit hole of, oh, okay, so most of education is centrally controlled. It's government run in most cases. That's probably why we're not seeing that same level of personalization and variety in education. So then I became increasingly interested in education. I discovered the whole idea of homeschooling and had a chance to connect with a homeschooling family. My senior year of college was totally blown away because I had gone through K to 12 public schools and never knew a homeschooler, never knew anything about kind of alternatives to school. So my mind was blown. I ended up getting a graduate degree in education policy and became more and more interested in creative schooling options, alternative education, and innovation. And at the time, if you were interested in any of that, and this was sort of the turn of the millennium, charter schools were where you focused. I got a little bit more involved in the charter school world. I was connected with the Pioneer Institute, a free market think tank in Boston. I was at Harvard at the time. And so did some work with Pioneer that was incubating charter schools kind of in their early days. But still felt like that wasn't quite enough, that there has to be even more to education innovation than charter schools, which are typically taxpayer funded, tuition free, but privately run, often by nonprofit organizations. So I felt like there still had to be more. And of course, I still was thinking about homeschooling and what I had seen with that family that I had met. So just began writing more and more about innovative education models, became a mom myself, chose homeschooling for my children, specifically self-directed education or unschooling. And then, continued writing and writing and writing about that. And then, of course, COVID hit. And now here we are where more and more families recognize that teaching and learning can and should be different.
Well, so you kind of like downplayed it. It's all just these steps in this journey, but I'm guessing, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was just very simple, gradual, and there wasn't really a moment. But there's usually a moment because, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm guessing that you probably did pretty well in the traditional school system. You probably got pretty good grades, seemed like you enjoy learning, you go into economics, you're doing well. Like you don't strike me as someone who you were like, I always hated the school system. It was always terrible for me.
Yeah, I mean, it really wasn't until that senior year of college when I was doing an independent research project and was able to shadow a homeschooling family and saw just how education could be outside of a conventional classroom, saw the sort of authentic socialization that this child had with the people, places, and things around her, saw her kind of natural curiosity and eagerness to learn and how at ease she was with adults. It was just so different from my experience. And at the same time, that I was shadowing this homeschooling family, I was doing a student teaching practicum in a local public elementary school with same age students as this homeschooling family. And never before had I sort of seen side by side, this conventional classroom, this group of second graders, and this homeschooled second grader. And it just couldn't have been more stark, even though, of course, I had gone through a public school that was almost identical demographically to that public school I was in as a student teaching practicum participant.
You saw the, hey, look, these kids over here, they're not socialized and these ones are.
Yeah.
And then you were like, well, maybe being socialized isn't what people say it is.
Yeah, it was sort of, everything that we talk about, Isaac. It's the sort of the age segregated classroom and the top-down curriculum and the focus on order and compliance and obedience over creativity and curiosity and originality.
I wanted to pause on that moment though for a second, because I think you did something really important that requires some openness and I think like humility. A lot of people, when they encounter, if the public school system didn't work for them at all and they really hated it and they didn't really understand why, and then they encounter something like homeschooling, they often have like oh, it wasn't just me that was the problem. But for people who really did well in that system, especially if they go into higher education, they're working on degrees or advanced degrees, having that experience where you're exposed to that, that can be a really hard moment where you're like, wait, so in order to say this maybe is a better way to learn, am I saying that I did things bad? And the fact that that's not easy to do, I think, to have that moment to say, oh, there's something here that I might want to look at and that I might want to consider, because the beliefs around schooling, the policies are obviously driving so much of the incentives, as you mentioned, but the beliefs, the social norms and expectations are such a strong part of why the status quo bias in education, right? It's really hard to think outside of that status quo because there's a high social cost for doing it. So here you are succeeding within the traditional education environment, and there's a bit of a social and reputational cost to deviating from that. So I'm curious if you ever faced a moment where you were like, am I going to be an outcast if I go this route?
If I thought of it that way, Isaac. I think one of the things, I loved college. And when I went to college, I think it was really where I rekindled my kind of natural love of learning and reading and all of that. I felt like in the public school system, I was checking boxes. I was doing what I was told. I was doing well, as you said. I was succeeding, but I never read for pleasure. I was always just sort of what I needed to do to get the A to move on to the next step. And then I think when I was out of that system and in college, when I started reading for pleasure again and, taking command of my own learning, falling in love with economics, which again kind of blew my mind, I looked back on my education experience and said, wow, I was really well schooled, but I don't feel well educated. And I think that was a pivotal moment for me and has really guided my work since then.
So right now, there's a lot of interesting things happening at once. And I think, I know your focus is on sort of alternatives and private educational options and homeschooling, but I think a lot of the things that are happening there are actually a result of something that happens further upstream, which is changes in public schools, or at least changes in people's attitudes about public schools. And so it's kind of like, you sort of have your first wave of maybe early adopters with alternatives who are doing it for a positive reason. They're choosing something explicitly that they want. Maybe it's religious instruction or something like that, and they're going to those options. But then there's sort of the next wave, which is negative reasons. Hey, I'm experiencing things I don't want in the public school system. So first choice is I'm leaving. Then the second choice is, well, what am I going to do instead? And there's not necessarily a clear vision of what you're going to do instead. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I've kind of seen since COVID, and you can see it in public school enrollment. The numbers are declining. And a lot of public school administrators are kind of like trying to evade asking the question why, and kind of like, it's demographics. We don't really know. But there's a reason when you ask parents. I mean, I'm a part of different homeschool co-ops and tutorials, and they're all getting flooded with new homeschoolers who are exiting the traditional system for specific reasons. They don't like what they're seeing. So I'm curious if you have a pulse on kind of the dissatisfaction. I think the satisfaction numbers, if you believe polls about public schools, are the lowest that they've been in 50 years or something like that. I'm curious your take on like what's happening with public schools right now and why are so many people looking to exit?
Yeah, I think dissatisfaction is definitely a part of it, but I think the larger trend is really that we saw over the first couple of decades of the new millennium a rise in alternative education models, a rise in microschools and microschool networks. Obviously, you were running Praxis, an alternative to college, and kind of providing that hands-on apprenticeship opportunity for young people. We saw other kinds of self-directed learning centers for homeschoolers emerging. So there were all of these trends happening before 2020. And then when schools shut down and learning went remote for all of America's school children, all of a sudden parents started to have to be creative. They realized they had to start taking matters into their own hands because schools were in most places staying closed into the fall of 2020. And so you saw in the summer of 2020 this rise of pandemic pods, these sort of spontaneous parent-driven learning communities, parents saying, wow, I have to look at what I need to do for my kids so that they can continue to learn, so they can have safe social interactions. So there was a real sense of parent empowerment. And that was occurring alongside remote learning as parents really, for the first time in many cases, got an up close view of what was actually happening in their students' classrooms. Some of it was dissatisfaction that they observed with the curriculum or the behaviors of teachers or students. But a lot of it from the parents and founders that I've talked to was, hey, I can do this. Like, this isn't rocket science. So I think that also really propelled parents to be empowered to seek or build education solutions for their kids while the kind of default local public school was shut down. So what happened was they looked, not only were they creating their own models, but they were also looking around and seeing, oh, yeah, I knew about this homeschooling thing, or I knew about microschooling, but I never really thought it was an option for me. And then they started to see that not only is this an option, it could be a better option. People in their communities are building these options. In many cases, certainly the vast majority of the founders I interview, these are former public school teachers who left a conventional classroom to build a homeschooling collaborative, a microschool, a learning pod. So they saw that the people running these programs, had a lot of credibility. And gee, if they're leaving the system, maybe they're onto something there. And then that's just continued. The momentum continues to grow. I see more and more microschools emerging over the past couple of years. Even then, were being created in kind of the first couple of years of school closures and education disruption caused by COVID. So this is not slowing down. And I think we're now seeing these network effects that are really catapulting this movement even further, because now parents know that if they're not satisfied with their child's schooling, they can and should look around, and they'll find that there are actually these low-cost private schools that maybe they didn't know were that accessible to them. Or maybe there are these kind of drop-off homeschooling programs that they can look into that will make homeschooling feasible for them. So there's a lot more, I think, parental awareness of what's available and more demand for unconventional options from parents. And then, of course, in the beauty of the market, more prospective entrepreneurs recognize the demand for these new models and go off and build them. So I just think we're at the very beginning of this movement towards much more decentralized, entrepreneur-driven, choice-enabled education alternatives. We see the growth of school choice policies that enable education funding to follow families to whichever education setting they prefer. And that is also accelerating this trend.
By the way, life hack for anybody: if you are waiting for your lawn guys to show up, start recording a podcast and they will show up and start weed whacking outside your window every time without fail. Hopefully the noise doesn't come through. I really love what you said there, because, and this is why you are the legend, because I was getting so hyped and inspired as you were talking there. The premise that I laid out, that like, hey, maybe it was the dissatisfaction with the status quo that's driven all this innovation, is not entirely untrue. But I think what you teased out is you're sharing like what you're hearing from people who are actually starting microschools or going to microschools, or pulling out of the traditional approach for some form of alternative, was more about what they saw they could do. And so It makes me think, go back to our Austrian economics, which we've already mentioned on here. My favorite economist, Ludwig von Mises, he talks about 3 preconditions for humans taking any action. You have to have dissatisfaction with the status quo, a vision of something better, and a belief in your ability to get there. And if you don't have all 3 of those conditions, you're not going to act. And so the dissatisfaction, maybe that's not so much the new part. Maybe that's kind of always been there in the background. Like, yeah, maybe there's things I dislike about this, but if you believe that that's all there is, you don't have a vision of anything better or a belief in the ability to get there, you won't act. And then the second part, okay, maybe there's a vision. Maybe I've heard of other schools, private schools, maybe even micro schools or homeschooling, but I don't have a belief in my ability to get there. That seems out of reach for me. I don't think I'm capable of that. And then when the pandemic hit, you suddenly were forced to be the one that tried to help your kids get education in some way. And you realized, hey, I can get there. And that third condition was fulfilled. Okay, the dissatisfaction is there and I can see something better. And guess what? I actually can do it. This isn't that hard. It's more of a positive experience of what people are capable of and what kids are capable of. The number of parents I heard say, yeah, my kid kind of just like didn't do anything for the first several weeks when school was canceled, and it didn't really hurt them. They were okay. Like, they're okay. They're not like hopelessly behind. They're not going to be, incapable of navigating life or learning to read or whatever. And that realization that kids are going to be okay. They can learn with more freedom and less structure, and that parents are going to be okay. The burden is not maybe as heavy as you thought it was to ensure that your kids are going to have an educational experience. I just think that was such a pivotal moment to put gasoline on a fire of a trend that I think was sort of steady. Homeschooling and increasing in options was steadily upticking, but now it's going crazy. I mean, it's 20% plus per year. If again, the numbers around things like homeschooling are very dubious, but if you believe them.
Yeah, and I think you make an interesting point about the dissatisfaction. I think for a lot of families, they just swallowed their dissatisfaction prior to COVID and its aftermath because they didn't really have a choice, right? I mean, they were compelled under a legal threat of force to send their children to an assigned district school.
Or pay really, really high tuition for a private school that looked basically the same in many cases.
Yeah, or try to homeschool if that was doable for them. But there were lots of barriers to those other options. And so they ended up sending their kids to these local schools, even if they weren't the best fit. What you see now, though, is that there's this tremendous explosion of low-cost private schools. And again, with the rise of school choice policies, many of these schools are free, tuition free or nearly so, making them much more accessible to more families. And homeschooling becomes more accessible because many of these microschools I talk about are actually collaboratives of homeschoolers where you can attend part-time or full-time up to a full-time schooling alternative at a fraction of the cost of a traditional private school. So all of that became much more accessible. I think one of the exciting trends that I'm seeing more recently is that in microschool founders I've talked to, they say that their early classes, their kindergarten classes and first grade classes are filling with students who've never before been in a conventional classroom. So these are parents who are choosing unconventional education right out of the gate. They're not responding to some dissatisfaction in the traditional system. There wasn't some inflection point that happened in second grade and they have to find another spot for their kid. They're choosing it right away. And I think to your point of sort of the adoption, the what is it, the diffusion innovation curve, or it talks about early adopters and then early majority, late majority. I think we're moving along that curve because now you're having families see this as a viable option at the very beginning. Now, you certainly still have families who have some struggle point in a traditional school and then look around to see if there's a solution. But more and more, we're seeing this as a coveted option right from the get-go.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember back when I was early on starting Praxis, this college alternative, the types of people that were interested in conversations around, hey, maybe there's something better than college to prepare me for a career, were like two radical ends of the bell curve. It was people who were thinking, I don't know if I can afford college, so I got to find something that's cheaper, or people who could afford literally anything, but they were like, hey, I can do it. I can send my kid anywhere. So if I want the very best for them, let me analyze things. And I started to see the same in K through 12, maybe 10, 15 years ago, whereas you would talk to, let's say, very wealthy entrepreneurs who'd been very successful, or even actors or athletes who would say, I'm doing like unschooling or Waldorf or Acton Academy or something for my kid because I can afford the best and I want the best. And then you'd see people on the far opposite end of the spectrum who were like, hey, wife is at home, dad is at work, and we have a, very tight budget, but we're going to do a homeschool curriculum and we never spend more than $20 on a book. And you kind of had like sort of elites use as like a luxury good doing these alternatives. And then all the way on the other end, people who are, and now I think kind of like that middle majority, just sort of the average person in the suburbs, middle class, just starting to break in and realize that this is something that's viable for them as well. And it's been really interesting to watch, even just as an experience. Growing up homeschooled, people would look at you like you had two heads and right to your face be like, well, you're not going to be able to socialize, when I was like 10. And then 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when our kids are very young and we're homeschooling them, people would look at us like, oh, well, I think I have a friend who did that. That kind of worked well for some people. Fast forward to today, the predominant response we get when we tell parents we homeschooled is, oh, I wish I could do that. It's like night and day difference from growing up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think more and more parents are realizing that they have these options, that they're accessible, that they're high quality, that they can really find personalization in education the way they have in all other areas of their lives. So I think that's a big part of this is parents are just no longer putting up with sort of an outdated one-size-fits-all mass schooling system. When on their smartphones, they have so much personalization and customization, and yet they don't have that in their children's education. I think they're just not tolerating it anymore.
Yep. Yeah. So here's a part of the, even in our name, OpenEd, and the concept of open education or the opening of education. One of the trends that is really interesting to me is that a lot of even the words that we've been using here, a lot of the definitions and frameworks kind of get fuzzy and blurry and the lines blur. So, even take something that seems as clear cut as public or private. Okay, well, public is maybe run by the government and private isn't. Well, then you've got things that are funded by the government, like charter schools, but they're privately run. Then the lines blur further. Well, then you have, let's say, a micro school completely privately run and paid for by parents, but the parents are receiving dollars from the state through an education savings account.
Right.
And then there's like, it's kind of public-ish because it's being purchased with public dollars, but there's this whole continuum. And then things like homeschool versus like a micro school or a co-op or a learning pod or just school itself. Like if my kids go to a church and meet with 30 other families 3 days a week, do they go to school or do they homeschool? And some of these things, and it's really interesting, even online or in person. Yeah. Well, it's kind of a little bit of both. Like my kid does Khan Academy for math, but he goes and does an art class with other kids, and then there's like the unschooled. I mean, there's large parts of days or entire days where my kids are much more self-directed or don't have any scheduling or programming. And so some of the breakdown in these walls has been a really interesting thing to observe. It makes it harder to talk about these things, which is inconvenient for people like us who do a lot of talking and writing about them. But as a parent in the trenches, I don't care what you call it. I just need to have all the tools available on the table.
Yeah. And of course, again, even pre-2020, this was happening. But I'll often hear people say, well, what do you mean? You're a homeschooler, but you can go to this school 5 days a week. And I guess that's a microschool. Some microschools run as programs for students who are legally homeschoolers. Some microschools run as state recognized private schools. So you're right. There's all of this overlap and muddiness around these definitions. I will say that some of the reason for that could be state and local regulations. So, yes. For example, I talk a lot about entrepreneurial barriers to entry and scale that some of these school founders encounter. And one of the states that's the most difficult to launch, in particular, a secular private school, is Nevada, because they have occupational licensing requirements. You cannot open a private school, a secular private school in the state of Nevada, unless you have a state teacher or administrator license. One of the only states in which that's the case.
So you got to found a new religion and do it that way as a religion.
You have to be, church-based schools are exempt from this. So I've talked to founders who wanted to open a private school, an unconventional private school, or even more of a traditional private school, but were unable to because they didn't have that state license. So thankfully, Nevada has some of the most flexible homeschooling laws in the country. And so many of these founders have turned around and created microschools for homeschoolers that essentially work as these low-cost private schools for homeschoolers, but the parents are ultimately the ones complying with homeschool regulations, reporting, kind of managing, controlling their children's education, but they're outsourcing some of that instruction to these microschools. And right now, the latest data that I've gotten from the National Microschooling Center, which is based in Las Vegas, they tell me that there's about 25 or 30 microschools kind of in the 10-mile radius around the Las Vegas Strip, serving some 700 students at the moment. So, micro is scalable. It's just that a lot of these programs are scaling small. There's just many of them now.
That's the thing that is so exciting to me about just watching and talking to all of these innovators. Like, we all know, you and I know anyway, maybe everybody doesn't, but that all of these regulations and hurdles, barriers to entry because of all these different state policies, a confusing web of different policies at the state, local, federal level, they make everything less efficient than it would be if they weren't there. But despite them, entrepreneurs always find really creative ways to like
Yes.
figure it out anyway and fill in those gaps. And you have all these bizarre things happening, like you mentioned, Nevada, where like, hey, homeschooling is pretty permissive,
Right.
but you can't open a private school that's non-religious, which is like a weird gap. You see this with ESAs a lot too, where they will allow parents to use it for a tuition voucher, essentially, to pay for tuition at a typical accredited school, or to like buy books and supplies themselves directly, but not to pay for like a micro school or a co-op or something that is unaccredited. And it's kind of like, well, that's weird because letting parents just buy supplies themselves directly seems further on the radical spectrum of like choice and independence
Yeah.
than a non-state accredited little micro school might be, but this thing in the middle is prohibited. Well, I mean, policy's always irrational and crazy like that, but innovators keep finding ways to do it anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I've talked to some of these founders who are running essentially 5-day-a-week programs for homeschoolers, including in states where they could run a private school relatively easily. They don't have these occupational licensing requirements that Nevada has. And I'll say to them, have you thought about becoming a recognized private school? You're essentially operating like a private school anyway. Why not just become a private school? It's not that hard. And they'll say to me inevitably, we don't want a traditional schooling model. We want the parents to be empowered to, educate their children how they choose. We want them to be able to have the freedom to travel and not be focused on compulsory school attendance laws. We want parents to be able to choose part-time options if they'd like to do that, and pick and choose among different days of the week. So the founders themselves want that freedom and flexibility that can be found through homeschooling, again, where parents are legally the ones responsible for their children's education. And they don't, in many cases, have any desire to become a recognized private school.
Yeah, what's cool about all this unfolding too is that it forces traditional private schools and public schools to improve and to innovate a little
Mm.
bit. So one example, if a lot of parents will say things like, hey, I would love to do some kind of homeschooling or micro school or something alternative for my kids, but I want to like still leave open the possibility, maybe when they're a teenager, they want to go be a part of the public high school. I'm scared that they won't be able to do that if I'm not in the system from the get-go. They're not doing the normal standardized testing, all this stuff. Not only is it absolutely possible, but it's getting easier because public schools realize that they're going to have to, like, hey, maybe this kid's going to not be in the system for part of the time, but if we want them in our system at all, we got to be a little bit more flexible about what we will allow people to come and go, or kids that will just literally take one period or one class at a public school that they really like, that has a really good teacher, and they want to be a part of it, but they want to do the rest of it on their own. Or public school students that their parents travel for work and they'll travel for a month and then come back. And like, that's actually okay. Most people don't know that. They think that they'll get kicked out or something, but you can do it. And the schools are kind of being forced to flex and adapt to these changes as well, which is, again, competition makes everyone better.
Yeah, I hope we'll continue to see public schools compete with these alternative
I'm
models.
being generous. They are sometimes, but
I
not as
hope
much
they
as I think they
will.
could be.
I think you're right. As public school enrollment declines, they're going to have to figure out ways of attracting and retaining students. I will say that I talked to a lot of founders who get students from traditional public schools who will say that they come to them several grade levels behind in many cases. And then the students are quickly able to catch up to grade level or beyond because of that individualized learning, because of mastery-based academics where, you're not just moving along on the fourth grade curriculum because you're in the fourth grade. You are moving along when you reach mastery in certain content areas, so that by the time those students maybe decide to go to high school, they'll be in a much better position than they would have been had they been in that conventional system to begin with, because they've had that individualized care.
Yeah, so this is really interesting that you mentioned the sort of the trends of people coming in and out of the system. We just did a survey of OpenEd families, and we had, almost 1,000 people respond and asking if their kid had ever been in a traditional school setting. And over 55% of them said yes, their kids had been in a traditional school setting before they did OpenEd, which is a more customized kind of parent-driven, student-driven. And then we asked, how likely would you be to enroll your child in a traditional school system again in the future? And about 80% said unlikely.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. People come and go, but like once you've kind of seen the flexibility you can get with all these various permutations of homeschooling, microschooling, et cetera, it is really hard to go back. With the exception of oftentimes there's a high school thing where like if the kids really want to go be in the high school, that's kind of a common thing. But it's pretty cool to see, and just to see the, even on the private school side, just the virtual options.
Yeah.
And charter schools, they're kind of being
Right.
forced to offer a lot more asynchronous, a lot more virtual, a lot more where it's like parent driven, student driven. Let me ask you, we have a few more minutes here. I'm curious, I have kind of two different questions, but maybe these are too much to get into quickly, but what are you seeing? You talk with as many people as anyone in terms of the innovators in education, the parents themselves. What are you seeing in terms of technology, the relationship between technology and learning? And let's just say screens in particular, because this is something that I think every parent is trying to figure out. What is the way to leverage and utilize the beauty of the internet and videos and all this stuff without turning my kid into a zombie or having them be isolated or addicted? And I'm curious, like if any of the innovators you're talking to, like there's all these different approaches. You can go like Waldorf, where it's like kids should only ever play with handmade wooden toys and be out in nature. And you can go like, no, just like straight up Khan Academy all day long, 24/7. You can learn anything you want from YouTube. What are you seeing and hearing out there?
Yeah, so I sort of have two responses to that. The first is that I think what we're seeing is a much more market-based approach to education. So a founder of a low-cost private school, microschool, homeschool collaborative will have sort of their own vision for education, and maybe that vision will be unlimited screen time, or maybe that vision would be some parameters around screens. And so what happens is the founders create policies around screens in their programs, and then let the market decide, right? If some parents are all in on a school that has unlimited screen time, then they'll enroll their kids there. If they want a school that has no screens, they'll enroll their kids there, right? It's just part of a way of differentiating different schools. And I see a lot of different founders approaching this in different ways. That said, I do think it's important to recognize technology as such a key tool to enabling the growth of these unconventional educational models that now, we're able to tap into such extraordinary, in some cases, free or low cost software, like you mentioned, Khan Academy, entirely free, that has, a great sort of mastery based approach to learning, particularly in math, but other subjects as well. You see other technology tools that do similar things. And so that just makes these unconventional spaces able to do what they're going to do in many cases, because they don't need to have, a calculus teacher and a physics teacher, and they don't have to know all of the content in their one-room schoolhouse. They can leverage technology in these really clever ways. So I think that's definitely in the background. But yeah, I've seen founders approach technology in all kinds of different ways, and then be responsive to what those families they're serving really want.
So I want to ask you if you have, I'll let you pick. Would you want to give a prediction? And it's got to be something more specific than, hey, the trend of, increasing educational choice will continue, or a favorite story that kind of illustrates what's happening in this space to send us off.
A favorite story or a prediction in numbers? Oh,
It
man.
doesn't have to be numbers, but just, something slightly more specific than, it doesn't have to be numerical, but then like, hey, yeah, more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll go with the numbers because that's the first thing that comes to mind. If we look at data coming out of the Johns Hopkins University Homeschool Hub, and a wonderful new resource that's been created this year that's run by education professor Angela Watson, really trying to get a handle on numbers of homeschoolers. And it's tricky to do because some states don't report, but they're reporting up to about 6% of America's school-age population is now homeschooled. About 11% are in private school, and about 7% are in charter schools. And this is according to the latest Census Bureau data. Those numbers are going to go up.
Yep. Yep. And
All
for
of those.
context, so that would be, because I think there's about 60 million public school students. That might include charter. So that would be about 4-ish million homeschoolers, maybe. Is that about right?
About 3.5 million.
3.5
Yeah.
million. Okay.
hmm
Got it. Got it.
Yeah, so those numbers are going to go up, already with school choice policies expanding across the country, 33 states with some version of private school choice, enabling families to leave a district school for a private education option. Currently, EdChoice estimates about a little over a third, over 20 million students are eligible or will soon be eligible for a private school choice program. So there's just those trends that are continuing to grow. And as more and more families expect more options, then I think we're going to see the continued expansion of school choice policies and the continued growth of these new schools and spaces.
And those numbers have grown fast. If I recall that homeschooling number of 3.5 million, it was like 2.1 million like 5 years ago.
Yes.
So we're talking some serious growth happening.
Yeah.
I love it. Carrie, anywhere besides fee.org where people should look for you?
Yeah, please visit me at fee.org/liberated. There you can find podcast episodes and connect with me. Also on Twitter at Kerry_edu or X these days.
Love it. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Thanks, Isaac.